All right, hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Dexter Van Zile, Managing Editor of MEF's new publication, Focus on Western Islamism, join us to discuss A Muhammad Picture and Hamline's Crisis. We'll begin with a 15-minute of interview-style conversation, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, let's dive into our first question. So we're talking about the Hamline University in Minnesota and what happened there with the showing of the images of Muhammad in art history class. Can you give us a brief chronology of what happened?
That's probably the one time when it was bad for me to be muted. I'll try to be brief. What happened was that in early October, Erika López Prater, who is an adjunct faculty member at Hamline University, or was, showed two pictures of Muhammad during class, during an art history class, and they were from the 14th and 16th centuries, and they were basically pictures that obscure one of the images obscured his face. But these images were drawn to venerate Muhammad, not to discredit him or insult him in any way, and they were drawn by Muslims. So these were essentially pious images of Muhammad. And the thing was that the professor had warned her students in class and in the syllabus that she was going to actually be displaying these images long before she ever did. And she said, if you are going to be offended by these images, then we can figure out another way to get the material across to you, and we can make it so that you do not have to see these images. And she had sent that syllabus according to a legal brief that was filed in a lawsuit against the university. She had sent the syllabus both to the people in the art history or the art department at Hamline University and to the administration itself, with these essentially trigger warnings in the document. And no one objected at the school, according to the legal brief. And so essentially, she showed the images on October 8th, and after the class was over, there was a student by the name of Aram Wedatala, who was also president of the Muslim Student Association. She complained, and she essentially told the professor that she was really offended by the display of these images. And the professor herself then spoke to her superiors at the university and told her that one of the students objected. And essentially and this student then went on to complain to the university. And within a very short period of time, one of the administrators issued a statement saying that the broadcast or the display of these images in class were undeniably Islamophobic. And one of the things that this vice president also announced was that she was not going to be coming back to teach the following semester. They were going to essentially sever the relationship that she had with the school. And according to the legal brief filed on her behalf against Hamline University, she had already gotten very good reviews from the students or praise from the students, and they had already asked her if she would come back the following semester. And essentially that was really the controversy really was hit public around Christmas time. But on December 8th, there was a campus meeting in which an official from the local chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations by the name of Jailani Hussein, the director of the Minnesota chapter of that organization, he showed up. He was on the meeting, and at the meeting, which was videotaped. And one of the things that he said was that, look, Muslims throughout the world are going to be offended by the display of these images. And this is according to the legal brief. And also that essentially you could have another Charlie Hebdo situation on your hands, which was a very shocking thing for me to see in the brief. Because essentially, if you remember the Charlie Hebdo massacre that took place in 2015, a number of people were killed by jihadists who were offended by the display of images insulting Muhammad. And so essentially that was really one of the things that when I saw that in the brief, I was personally shocked, because it was kind of an implicit threat, like, look, you need to be careful about these images. And so that is really where it stood for a while. And then the Foundation for Individual Rights and Freedom issued a statement saying that Hamline basically failed in its obligation to protect academic freedom. And essentially, in the past few weeks, the faculty at the university has asked for the university president, Fenice Miller, to resign. And also, they essentially apologized after the lawsuit was filed. They said we were wrong to say that this was Islamophobic, and essentially they used the language of saying that we made a misstep. And most interestingly about all of this, and I think this is the important upshot, is that the National Organization of the Council on American Islamic Relations essentially said that this was not an instance of Islamophobia. So they have issued a statement that directly contradicts what was said by their local chapter. And that, I think, is where it stands right now. Sadly enough, I think that the controversy is still going on, and the local school newspaper has done a terrible job of covering it, and it's very sad.
Thank you for that overview. So in your commentary about the controversy, you were quite critical of the Minnesota chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. What role did CARE Minnesota play in stoking the controversy?
Well, I think one of the things that they've done essentially is to try and promote this narrative of Muslims being fragile here in the United States, and that they are basically a beleaguered and victimized minority. And during a press conference that was held on January 11th, after the controversy really started to generate a lot of negative publicity for the university, they came to the defense of the university's president. And that December 8th meeting is, I think, going to be crucial, I think, in the way that this story goes forward. I really do hope to see the video of that meeting, which is mentioned, released at some point, either during discovery as a result of the lawsuit, because I think that's going to be a crucial moment, because we want to see exactly what Jailani Hussein said and how he behaved during this meeting. But essentially, it seems as if they used the weird thing about this is it's almost as if Hamline University is allowed essentially a certain amount of its, if you forgive the phrase, institutional sovereignty. It's handed it over to the local chapter of, CARE Minnesota. And by bringing up the Charlie Hebdo massacre, essentially what they did was they injected an element of fear in the discourse about these images and academic freedom that simply does not belong on a college campus anywhere.
Thank you. There seems to be a division between CARE National in Washington, D.C. and the local CARE chapter. What do you think is going on?
I think that Muslim leaders in the United States and even some Islamist leaders in the United States are starting to realize that they're coming to the end of the line in which, or to the road or journey in which they can essentially portray Muslims as hapless, perpetual victims of oppression in the West. I just did an interview with Ismail Royer just a few weeks ago that was published on Focus on Western Islamism. And one of the things that he said is that, look, let's be clear. Muslims in the United States are actually able to practice their faith without much interference from their neighbors. And you can try to whip up hostility or resentment over the so-called oppression that they endured. But if you look closely, essentially what we're looking at is he even described the United States as the equivalent of Ethiopia, where the early followers of Muhammad were able to get some respite and some safety from their persecutors during the early stages of the founding of their religion. And I think that the notion, and one of the arguments or criticisms that Ismail Royer has leveled at CARE in the past is the promotion of this grievance victim narrative, so to speak, on behalf of Muslims in the United States. He says, what that organization really needs to do at this point is to essentially start to promote and pursue the public good. And I don't know whether or not they're going to take Ismail Royer's criticism to heart. But I think that they realized that, the local chapter of the Muslim Student Association and the local chapter of CARE essentially took it too far. And essentially you can watch, I would encourage people to look on YouTube for the press conference, the January 11th press conference, because essentially they just promoted this notion of grievance and victimhood. And one of the more troubling elements of this press conference is when the student from the Muslim Student Association who was in the class essentially approached the microphone and tearfully talked about the trauma of actually seeing these images. And it was like promoting this notion that Muslims are so fragile and in constant need of protection. I think is not a look that even many Muslims really want to embrace anymore.
Absolutely, thank you. So you mentioned the school newspaper earlier in your
Right.
overview. What role did the school newspaper play in stoking the controversy, and is it still stoking this controversy?
Right. One of the interesting things is that a faculty member actually wrote an opinion piece in defense of the art history professor, Lopez Prater. But they took that article down for the alleged harm that it had done to Muslim students on the campus, which is pretty shocking because essentially, I read the newspaper, not every day, but there are things that, offend my sensibilities all the time. And I'm a pretty fragile individual, but the problem is that nobody worries too much about that. The idea that you're going to take an article down that has been published that makes a legitimate defense of somebody and enunciates essentially one of the most important principles of academia, which is academic freedom itself, is pretty outrageous. And just recently, they have continued to cover this story essentially from the perspective of the notion that this was an insult to Muslims. And that essentially, and one of the interesting things that they've done is that they have worked with another local newspaper called the Sahan Journal, which essentially represents the interests and concerns of the immigrant and community in Minnesota. And they've essentially kind of shared joint coverage. They published a story that was written by people from both publications. And just as Hamline University, essentially, it looks as if what they've done is handed over institutional sovereignty over to outsiders, namely and that's what it appears to be. Maybe I'm overstating it, but that's what, that's what it appears to be. It seems as if the Hamline Oracle, the local newspaper, is essentially kind of shared its editorial freedom or editorial responsibility and editorial independence with the publication that doesn't really have any connection to Hamline University. Now, I was the opinion editor of a school newspaper out in a school out in the Pacific Northwest a long time ago. And the idea, and those were kind of my salad days. I really enjoyed it. But the idea that I would ever hand like the editorial voice over to somebody from outside the school is just shocking. And when you compare what has happened at Hamline University with the editorial freedom and courage that was shown by the people at the Oberlin Review during the Mahalati scandal last year, and that's still ongoing, and I haven't seen any recent coverage about that at that school newspaper. The people at the Oberlin Review showed tremendous coverage and tremendous editorial freedom and doggedness that you would expect to see from professional journalists that we haven't seen, okay? And one of the reporters and the editors involved was a woman by the name of Gigi Ewing. She showed tremendous courage and independence in covering this, and she went after the administration. What we have at the Hamline Oracle is essentially people fronting for the administration. And from the perspective of a former collegiate journalist, if the local paper, if the school newspaper isn't going to challenge the mistakes made by the school's administration, the students really don't have a voice. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. So why did this story take off while so many others about this issue haven't gotten any traction?
I think they went after the wrong person, okay? Because I think that Erika López Prater, I think, was probably, for lack of a better word, a good liberal, okay? She was somebody that was on board with the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. She gave a number of trigger warnings. She gave a trigger warning in the class. She gave a trigger warning in the syllabus. And it doesn't look like she's some sort of fire-breathing right-wing conservative. She essentially does not want to make anybody unhappy or angry. And she's not part of the counter-Islamist community, so to speak. She's somebody that just wanted to teach art history, excuse me, and that's all she wanted to do. And she was doing a pretty good job of it. And once people realized that even the trigger warnings that she gave in good faith, these were good faith trigger warnings, when they were used against her at the January 11th press conference that took place in Minnesota. Essentially, both Jailani Hussein and Aram Wedatala said those trigger warnings are proof that she knew what she was doing was wrong. And so historically, if you didn't give trigger warnings, you were a bad person. Now, when somebody does give a trigger warning, oh, well, that's proof that you were basically operating in bad faith and you knew what you were doing was wrong. So I think that people in the academy are starting to recognize that, well, frankly, that they're coming for them too. And we all know that people in the academy generally tend to be on the left side of things, okay? If the professor had been on the right side somehow, or hadn't shown the obeisance to the DEI agenda that is required these days, well, they might have let that person just hang out to dry. But I think once the academy recognized that it was one of their own that was basically being subjected to the equivalent of a witch trial, then people said, we got a problem on our hands and we need to do something to stop this. This has gone too far. They're coming for us.
All right. And well, I really want to follow up with that is this a witch trial, and will this actually make a dent? Will people
Well, you see, I came from the university, the United Church of Christ, okay, and we were the inheritors of that whole fiasco, of the witch trial fiasco, and I think that maybe we are essentially where somebody could use the material from this event as sort of like another rewrite of the witch trial. I think there was a play called The Crucible, and this, you could call it, if I were to start like a newspaper at Hamline that was essentially kind of a dissident publication, I would call it, just off the top of my head, the Hamline Crucible. That's what I would call it. So yeah, I think that this was kind of the equivalent of a witch trial, and I think it woke a lot of people up, and it woke even maybe some of the wokesters up as well. I'm hoping.
Hopefully, absolutely. So in your commentary about the piece, you wrote that there is reason to hope that Muslim leaders in the West will abandon the ongoing effort to portray Muslims in the 21st century as potential or real victims of what Jews endured in the 20th. Clearly, you're making a larger point here.
Right.
So what are you trying to get at? Do you really think Muslim leaders are starting to realize promoting controversies like this is a losing strategy?
Maybe I'm being too hopeful, okay? But but I am more hopeful than I was when I first started it as managing editor of FWI, and because I think that, and so I think we've all heard about cultural appropriation. Well, I think what we're seeing to a certain extent is grievance appropriation. In the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II, essentially, we kind of drew a bright red line around the Jewish people and said, we need to be careful about how we talk about these people. And it wasn't just for the benefit and welfare of the Jewish people, but it was because of civilization itself. Because essentially we discovered in the aftermath of World War II that scapegoating the Jewish people was a sure way to basically lead to civilizational disaster. There was just no way around it. So there was a taboo about talking about the Jewish people in the ways that we used to. And I think and to sadly some extent, or to a large extent, we still do or have started to again. And what happened is that I think a various number of activists started to say, well, and excuse me for putting it in such blunt terms, it's like, well, we want some of that. We want to basically be treated with the kid gloves that we saw the Jewish people treated with in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And the thing is, and I just want to make it clear, is that a lot of the discussion and polemics about the Arab-Israeli conflict are essentially recapitulations of what we've heard about the Jews historically. And but the thing is that people thought, well, if we can portray ourselves as the victims, then what we can do is have our community rendered protected from the difficulties of the human condition and the difficulties that come from being a minority. And one of the things that, and I'm going to introduce a phrase, I've just written an article, hopefully it'll be this phrase won't, the Islamophobiacs. There are people out there that basically want to say that every time something bad happens to the Muslim community, it is the result of Islamophobia. And that ultimately everything, and I think that's really, that whole line of reasoning has been used to essentially protect, Muslims who behave badly from any real intense criticism or scrutiny for the things that they need to be scrutinized for. And I think that even right now, I think that there are people in the Muslim community that are starting to recognize that that's not really the way forward. During our interview, Ismail Royer said a civilization that is continually on the defense and resentful, and that's not an exact quote. Basically, that civilization is headed to disaster because it cannot renew itself. And so I think that's really what we're looking at is that people want to somehow grab on to the notion that they are the potential or real victims of what the Jews went through in the 20th century, so that essentially they are given a pass for any of the misdeeds that they have that need to be confronted. And the thing is that whatever grace has been that was accorded to the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust started to disappear in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And now people can say hateful and untrue things about Israel and Jews all the time. So.
And one last question. Obviously in the news right now, we have Ilhan Omar and ousting from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Can you draw any similarities there?
Well, I think first of all, she has said some things that normally that I think to a reasonable person or a reasonable man, so to speak, would be fearful or unhappy with her presence on the Foreign Affairs Committee, because essentially what she has said some unreasonable things, I know, just leave it at that, about a very important U.S. ally. And it looks as if she's doing this to whip up support for in the part of the Islamist community, not just here in the United States, but basically worldwide. And the thing is that when you look at it, this is just straight up politics. This is what happens in Congress. And I'm not a huge follower of what happens in Congress, but people get stripped from committee assignments all the time for whatever reason. And they always say, yeah, I'm a victim. This is terrible. This is anti-democratic. But that's life in the big city. That's how things go. And I think if you don't want those things to happen, there are certain ways to behave. I live in the city of Boston, okay? And I've learned that, there are certain, life in the city's tough. And so you have to learn how to basically adapt to, life at that level. And one of the ways you stay out of trouble is to not say crazy things about Israel. And frankly, she did. So there it is.
All right, thank
Sorry to
you.
be so blunt. I hope I haven't, offended the sensibilities of our listeners, but that's just, I'm feeling expansive this morning or this afternoon.
I'm sorry to change topics a little bit, but it sounded similar. Anyway, Carrie Hillebrand asks, is the abuse of Islamophobia being countered in the more prominent universities where it is rampant, such as CUNY in Columbia, UC Berkeley, et cetera?
See, that you would probably have to ask the folks who were more involved in Campus Watch. But my instinct is that things are pretty, if you're asking me, I think that it's very likely that essentially the accusation of Islamophobia is used to essentially silence criticism or any honest discussion about, political Islam or Islamism in the modern world. And if I were a college professor today, it would be one of the things that I'd want to talk about, but I would be afraid to do it. And just recently, last year, Colin May, who was he was the chief of the Human Rights Council for Alberta up in Canada. He was essentially ousted for an article that he'd written in praise of Ephraim Karsh's book about Islamic imperialism. And I read the article and I was like, there's nothing there. So anytime you talk about political Islam or the impact of Islamism on world politics and as a political force, you run into trouble. And I just borrowed a copy of Constantine Sword. You can talk about Christianity and its impact on the status of Jews, but if you talk about the impact of Islam on non-Muslims in Muslim majority environments, you get into a lot of trouble.
Thank you. So an anonymous attendee asks, I'm curious whether we can marshal the term Islamophobia to point out the hypocrisy of those who use it. Example, more than 100 Muslims were killed in a mosque by a Muslim. Can't we call that internal Islamophobia? Isn't Muslim on Muslim murder the real problem?
Well, you see now that, numerically, that's the issue. Is that ultimately, and that doesn't mean that is intra-Muslim violence is a huge issue, just the same way that intra-Christian violence has been a huge issue during the course of Western civilization. Okay, Christians have killed each other in huge numbers, and so have Muslims. And I think that tactically it's a very good idea, and and the thing is that, and just recently I've been reading a book by Khaled Beydoun called The New Crusades, in which he says that ultimately Islamophobia, there was a passage in there, he said that Islamophobia is a problem in Muslim majority countries as well. And I said that logically that doesn't make any sense. But the thing is that, Christians have had good reason to be frightened of one another. And Muslims have had good reasons to be frightened of one another in the course of their conflicts. So does that fear qualify as Christianophobia or Islamophobia? I don't think so, but if we deploy that logic and that type of language, it will really expose the incoherence of the Islamophobia regime.
Thank you so much. And David Levine asks, has the ACLU or other organizations who are allegedly fighting for the rights contained in the First Amendment offering any assistance?
Pan America did. That was one of the organizations that I was kind of surprised. And I should have looked at the National Writers Union because I have a confession to make. A long time ago, I was chairman of the Boston local of the National Writers Union. And right after 9/11, I helped author a resolution basically condemning the possibility of anti-Muslim bigotry in light of the attack. We never got it passed because we were too disorganized. But if you look at, there was also the American Association of University Professors. They came to López Prater's defense as well. So, and I would like to see that the National Writers Union would do something about it. But I think that and if they have, that would be good, because I would think that they would be very far to the woke or progressive side of the equation might not do that. But speaking as a former member, maybe they will, who knows? Or maybe they already have, I'll check that out.
All right, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Before we go, can you tell us where we can find some more of your work?
Okay, you can go to, our website is called Focus on Western Islamism, and the URL is islamism.news. And also you'll see an awful lot of our articles, or at least a few of them, republished on the website for the Middle East Forum. And I want to thank everybody for attending.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Dexter, for joining us today. We
Thank you,
appreciate
Stacey. All right.
For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.